The study was silent, save for the steady tick of the brass carriage clock on the mantelpiece. It was a curious silence, the kind that cloaked a room after something dreadful had taken place, a hush that seemed too complete, as though holding its breath. The body of Sir Benedict Compton, former diplomat and amateur historian, lay sprawled in the high, backed leather armchair beside his desk, his right hand dangling over the armrest, fingers curled loosely as if still gripping an invisible pen. There was no sign of forced entry. The French windows remained locked from within, the thick curtains drawn. The single door to the room was bolted from the inside, the key still in the lock. He had been discovered by his valet, Thomas Peveril, shortly before 9 that morning. Peveril, puzzled by the master's absence at breakfast and his failure to answer a knock at the study door, fetched the housekeeper. Together, they had forced open the door to find Sir Benedict already cold, a faint purplish tinge to his lips and no obvious sign of violence. Inspector Ruz Tarrant of the local constabulary arrived within the hour. He stood over the body with a frown, turning over details in his mind like pieces of a jigsaw that didn't quite fit. There was no weapon, no poison bottle, and no apparent injury. The doctor, summoned post-haste, could only mutter something about cardiac arrest, though he admitted the man had been in robust health the previous evening. Nothing in the room had been disturbed. The desk bore the typical detritus of a late night session, a lamp, extinguished, an open book with a ribbon marking a page on 16th century espionage, a glass decanter of brandy, still half full, a short glass on a silver coaster, used, but undisturbed. The scent of the room, heavy with pipe smoke and leather bindings, mingled faintly with the peculiar odor of almonds. It was the only oddity that struck Tarrant, a sweet, chemical tang that lingered, but subtly. But the strangest element was what lay on the floor beneath Sir Benedict's chair, a single, aged chess piece. The White Bishop. It looked antique, possibly ivory, and bore faint hairline cracks. Yet it was wholly out of place. The family kept no chess set in the house, and the valet swore that Sir Benedict had never played. Tarrant pocketed it without comment. Lady Imogen Compton, the widow, was serene in her grief, which only heightened suspicion. She sat poised in her morning room, sipping tea with a steadiness that bordered on unnatural. Her alibi was firm. She had spent the night in London, attending a charity dinner, corroborated by no less than 4 society matrons. The only other inhabitants of the manor that night were Peveril, the valet, Miss Eliza Compton, the niece, returned from university on holiday, and Mr. Raymond Chiswick, a fellow historian and long-time friend of the deceased, who had taken the guest room. Chiswick was the one who appeared most rattled. His eyes red-rimmed, hands trembling, though whether from grief or fear, Tarrant could not say. No arguments, no disputes lately? Tarrant asked during the preliminary interview. Eliza shook her head. Uncle Benedict was perhaps a little paranoid these past few weeks. He mentioned someone watching the house. But we thought it was just nervous. He'd been working late, reading strange things. What sort of strange things? Old letters, she replied. From his years abroad. He said something about secrets that ought never come to light. He didn't elaborate. Chiswick, when questioned, seemed evasive. He had theories. Benedict was always like that, obsessed with patterns, hidden meanings. But I hadn't noticed anything unusual lately. We talked about Thomas more the night before. Nothing political. Nothing deadly. The coroner's report arrived 2 days later. Cyanide, ingested in a small dose, probably added to the brandy. A suicide, they said, especially given the locked room and lack of evidence. But Inspector Tarrant wasn't satisfied. He returned to the study, stood once more beside the desk, and let the quiet settle around him. Something gnawed at the edge of his thoughts. The chess piece, the peculiar odor, the locked room, and then the book. He pulled the volume from the desk, flipping to the marked page. The passage described an Elizabethan cipher used by spies to pass messages. Embedded in the seemingly mundane, such as books, paintings, or even chess moves. The footnote at the bottom of the page referenced a white bishop used as a key in one such code. Tarrant's eyes narrowed. Sir Benedict had been working on something. Something he believed dangerous. Perhaps he had uncovered an old secret, one that threatened someone still alive. And the bishop, then, wasn't random. It was a message, or a warning. But how had the killer managed it? The door was locked, the windows sealed. No one had entered or left, yet the cyanide had been in the glass. That was certain. The brandy in the decanter was clean, tested and confirmed. So the poison had to have been added after the glass was poured. And Sir Benedict never drank alone. He was too cautious, too precise. Tarrant interviewed Piveril again. Did Sir Benedict ask for anything last night? The valet hesitated. He rang for the brandy just before midnight. I poured it and took it in. He dismissed me. That was the last I saw of him. You poured it yourself? Yes. From the decanter in the study. Tarrant's brow furrowed. There was no one else. No, sir. Only Miss Eliza passed me on the stairs. She was heading to her room. Did she speak? She asked if Uncle Benedict was still awake. I said yes. An idea began to form. Suppose someone knew about the decanter being clean. Suppose someone had prepared the glass in advance. A second glass, identical, poisoned and swapped in while the valet was distracted or gone. It would require timing, knowledge, and most of all, nerve. Tarrant searched the manor again, this time with a specific objective. In the guest room, under the wardrobe, he found it. An identical cut glass tumbler, faintly stained and reeking of almonds. Hidden carelessly, or perhaps in haste. He returned to Chiswick. Tell me, he said quietly. Did you leave your room last night after the house had gone to bed? Chiswick blinked. I may have done. I couldn't sleep. Did you go to the study? No. Why would I? To plant a poisoned glass and ensure Sir Benedict drank from it. Perhaps he trusted you more than anyone. Chiswick's face turned ashen. You can't prove that. Perhaps not yet. But I will. And when I do, I'll also prove why you left behind the bishop. It was, Tarrant thought grimly, no suicide. It was an execution veiled in history, silence, and one solitary clue: the game had begun. The following afternoon brought with it the arrival of a figure known well in certain circles for turning impenetrable puzzles into quiet certainties. Miss Harriet Vale stepped out of the motor car and into the damp gravel drive of Compton Manor, with a faint tightening of her lips. Not disapproval, but calculation. Her tailored grey coat and travelling hat were unassuming, yet her eyes, sharp, grey, unreadable, missed nothing as she scanned the facade of the house and the gathering storm clouds above it. She had been summoned by Lady Imogen herself, who, though the portrait of composure in public, had privately admitted her doubts to a friend in town. That friend had recommended Harriet Vale. Quiet, methodical, and known to untangle difficult matters with unnerving accuracy. Inspector Tarrant, though not hostile, wore the wary caution of a man unconvinced he required help. He met Harriet at the study door with polite reserve. "Welcome to the scene," he said, gesturing inside. "Locked room, poison. Coroner calls it suicide. I don't. Why not?" Harriet's voice was low, precise. Tarrant hesitated. Too neat. And then there's the chess piece. Doesn't belong. I've got my suspicions, mind you. But nothing watertight. She stepped inside without reply, letting her eyes sweep the room. The first thing she noticed wasn't the desk, nor the body, which had long since been removed. It was the absence of dust on a small corner of the mantelpiece. Every other surface bore a faint, even layer, but here, roughly the size of a book spine, was clean, recently disturbed. Was anything removed? She asked. Tarrant blinked. Nothing we catalogue. Books were untouched, far as we know. Something narrow. Possibly a diary or a folder. She turned. May I speak to those who were here that night? Lady Imogen received her with gracious indifference, offering tea and brief, aloof replies. She had no knowledge of chess pieces' poison or her husband's so-called secrets. He did say odd things lately. About betrayal, about legacy. But one gets used to that when one marries a man who never really retired from intrigue. Miss Eliza Compton was a different matter. Her nervousness was real, but not necessarily guilt. When asked about the chess piece, she blinked. He had a set once, she said quietly. From Istanbul, bone and mother of pearl, I think, but I haven't seen it in years. He claimed it was stolen during the war. Was he ever known to hide things? Hide things? Eliza looked puzzled. You mean like documents? I mean anything. A pause. Then, with the air of a child recalling a half-remembered story, Eliza said, there was something. I remember once Uncle Benedict showed me a hollow book. Not to use, he said. Just a habit from his younger days. For courier work. Harriet pressed gently. And the book? Is it still here? I wouldn't know where to start looking. That evening, Harriet returned to the study. Alone, she paced the perimeter again, noting how the windows latched, how the heavy velvet curtains hung unnaturally stiff, and how one corner of the rug failed to lie flat. She knelt, lifted it, and found what she suspected. A square floorboard, barely out of alignment. She tapped it. Hollow. With Tarrant's reluctant assistance, the board was lifted. Beneath, in a dust-laced cavity, lay the missing piece, a slim, leather-bound book wrapped in a cloth handkerchief. Harriet opened it carefully. It was not a diary. It was a ledger, dates, names, code phrases, brief notes in a tight hand. It was a spy's index, nothing less. At the back, a name had been added only recently, R. Chiswick, followed by one line, offer declined. Still a risk. Watch closely. Harriet did not show the book to anyone, not yet. The pieces were forming a pattern, but the shape was still incomplete. She needed to see how the remaining players moved. That night, she requested to dine with the household. At the table, the air was stiff with forced civility. Mr. Chiswick was pale, eyes flicking to Harriet often, while Eliza pushed peas about her plate without appetite. I was told, Harriet said casually, that Sir Benedict had developed a sudden taste for chess. Chiswick laughed too quickly. Not chess. He collected oddities, that's all, trinkets with history. He didn't play, he loathed games. Strange, then, that a chess piece was found beneath his chair. Chiswick paled. I suppose it could have been there for years. This house collects clutter. Eliza mentioned a missing set. His fork clattered to his plate. Well, then, perhaps it's not so mysterious. Coincidence. Lady Imogen dabbed her lips. Do you believe someone murdered him over a game? Not over a game, Harriet replied softly, but over the thing that game represented. She let the silence bloom after that, watching them each retreat into their thoughts. That was when she saw it, the flicker. As Chiswick reached for his water, Eliza's gaze dropped to his wrist, and her expression hardened, just for a moment. A muscle ticked in her cheek, not resentment. Later, Harriet asked her directly, You've seen that watch before? Eliza hesitated. Yes. It's Uncle Benedict's. I thought it strange when Mr. Chiswick wore it, but assumed it was a gift. He told me it was an heirloom. Passed down. He's lying. That confirmed something Harriet had already begun to suspect. The man was shifting the past to fit the present. He'd handled the glass. Possibly placed the poison. But the motive was not yet clean. The ledger, yes, that was valuable. But it was more than information. There was something personal in Chiswick's nervousness. Later, alone in her guest room, Harriet reviewed the ledger again. She found one more name at the top, crossed out, nearly illegible. And yet not entirely. Imogen. So the widow had once been watched too. Harriet closed the book slowly. The late Sir Benedict hadn't merely catalogued his enemies. He had catalogued everyone. Every potential threat. Every betrayal, real or imagined. And one by one he had been preparing to act on them. What if Chiswick had known? What if Lady Imogen had known? What if the chess piece wasn't a warning, but a mark? A declaration of who was next? The bishop had been white. The piece that moves diagonally, quietly. Strategically, Harriet knew what she would do next. She would not confront Chiswick, not yet, but she would watch. Carefully. Because someone had begun playing long before the murder, and someone else hadn't yet finished. The following morning brought a brittle stillness to Compton Manor, broken only by the low murmurs of the staff, going about their duties with uneasy restraint. Harriet Vale sat in the library with a notepad on her lap and a small brass pencil in hand. She had already gone over the ledger twice, now focusing instead on its implications. Sir Benedict hadn't been paranoid, he had been meticulous, perhaps vengeful. He had not merely feared enemies from his diplomatic past, he had catalogued them, cross-referenced them, prepared for something. It was time to listen very carefully to how people shaped their truths. She began with the least threatening, Thomas Peveril, the valet. He entered stiffly, cap clutched in both hands. Harriet offered him a seat and a calm voice. "You worked for Sir Benedict how long?" 13 years. "Miss, since just after the war. And you were with him the night he died?" "Yes, miss. I brought him his brandy about 11:30. He asked for it himself, from the decanter in the study." He hesitated. "That's right. But didn't you say earlier that you brought it from the cabinet in the drawing room?" He blinked, color rising in his face. "No, I must have misspoken. It was the study. Always the study." Harriet made a note. "You saw no one else that night?" "Miss Eliza passed me on the stairs. She said you told her Sir Benedict was still awake."
Yes.
"What did she do after that?" "I assume she went to bed." "I didn't see her again." But he didn't sound sure. Harriet thanked him and dismissed him. The slip about the drawing room bothered her. Was it simply a lapse? Or was Peveril protecting someone? Or worse, following instruction? Eliza Compton came next, her posture tense but chin high. Harriet didn't ask about the poison or the bishop. She asked about her uncle. "Did you and your uncle argue often?" Eliza shook her head. "We disagreed sometimes. Especially recently, he was watching me, reading my letters. He thought I was being manipulated." "By Raymond? Were you?" She hesitated, eyes flicking away. "No, he's just a friend." "Uncle Benedict hated anyone he couldn't control." "But you still trusted Mr. Chiswick." Another pause. "I trusted him more than I trusted Uncle." "Did you know he was wearing your uncle's watch?" Her mouth tightened. "Yes. I didn't mention it because I didn't want to start a storm. I thought, perhaps it had been given. But now, I'm not sure. You saw him after the house was meant to be asleep, didn't you?" A flicker in her gaze. "He came to my door. Around midnight. He said he'd heard something in the corridor." "And what did you say?" I told him I hadn't heard anything and that he should go back to bed. Did he? I assume so. I didn't follow him. The lies were soft ones, blunted by emotion. Harriet couldn't yet say whether they were meant to protect Chiswick or herself. She found Raymond Chiswick in the smoking room, as if hiding in plain sight. He stood when she entered but didn't offer to shake hands. "You've known Sir Benedict a long time," she began. "Since university, we were friends. Rivals too? Once. And you stayed here often? Every year at Christmas. And some summers. But this time," he rubbed his face. He was changed. Paranoid. Talking about past enemies, codes, betrayals. "Did you believe him?" "I humored him." "You didn't ask what he meant by offer declined." His expression didn't shift, but his knuckles whitened. "What?" "In his notes," she said lightly, "he mentioned you. That you declined an offer and were now a risk." He stared at her, then looked away. "It was nothing. Years ago. Some conversation we had. Back when we were both trying to get posted abroad. He suspected I'd shared something. I didn't. But he didn't believe you." "No. He never truly trusted anyone." "Not really. Why keep coming here, then?" He met her eyes now. "Because I thought if I stayed close, I could steer him away from his obsessions. I failed." There was real emotion in his voice. And yet, Harriet felt something calculated beneath the surface. His answers were just vague enough, just safe enough. Too smooth. And that watch still gleamed on his wrist, ticking quietly like a borrowed heartbeat. Lady Imogen was last. She greeted Harriet in the solarium, calm, impeccable, as if untouched by the tension coiling through the house. "You asked me here," Harriet began. "Why?" "Because my husband is dead. And no one seems inclined to explain why with any clarity. But you knew there was more to it." "I suspected." Benedict was a collector of secrets, not a keeper of peace. He didn't merely remember the past, he revived it. "I feared it would destroy him." "Did you ever think it might destroy someone else instead?" Lady Imogen tilted her head. "You mean, did I think someone might kill him?" "No. He was difficult, not hated." "Your name appears in his ledger," Harriet said, watching her, "but it's crossed out." A pause. "Then perhaps he decided I was no longer dangerous. Or perhaps someone else made the decision for him." Imogen's lips twitched in something like amusement. "I didn't kill my husband, Miss Vale. Nor did I poison his glass, sneak through locked doors, or leave antique chess pieces under furniture. But you knew about the ledger. And the bishop. I knew he had hidden things. I knew he used symbols. That bishop piece was a threat, not a clue. He'd used it before. He once sent it to an ambassador whose loyalty he doubted. It was his private signal. You were exposed." Harriet's mind clicked. A warning. Not just a breadcrumb. Whoever placed the bishop had wanted Sir Benedict to know he'd been found out. Which changed everything. The poison hadn't been delivered silently. It had been wrapped in a message. A final move on the board. And perhaps not by Chiswick at all. Perhaps someone who feared exposure more than guilt. Harriet rose, her tone calm. "Thank you, Lady Imogen. You've been most helpful." She stepped into the corridor, her mind racing. The lies were not crude. They were elegant, careful. Each built upon a truth that had been ever so slightly bent. But the tension beneath them had begun to creak. Someone in this house had been marked. Someone had acted before the truth could rise fully into the light. And now, Harriet knew the next question she had to ask. Who had known the bishop's meaning, and who had feared it the most? Rain slicked the windows of Compton Manor as the afternoon wore on, the weather matching the brooding tangle of questions Harriet Vale now carried. The bishop, no longer just a curiosity, but a silent accusation, loomed large in her mind. It narrowed the suspects, but it also complicated their motives. Whoever left it wanted Benedict to know they were watching. But the poison, that had been personal, final. She retreated once more to the study, notebook in hand, drawing lines and names like a spider weaving from the center outward. Chiswick, Eliza, Imogen, Peveril, all with reason to fear exposure, all close enough to act. Yet none of their stories fit neatly. Each account offered something incomplete. She needed to test them not just for truth, but for cohesion. She began with the glass. If Peveril had poured the brandy from the decanter in the drawing room, as he had first said, then the poison could have been added earlier, perhaps by anyone. But if he had used the decanter in the study, as he later insisted, that narrowed it. She checked the study decanter again. Its contents had been sealed away for forensic testing, but a faint ring inside told her it had been used recently. And it had been moved, a shade to the left, off-center from the tray. Not Peveril's style. But someone had been in this room after Benedict was dead. And they had either planted the chess piece or tampered with the scene. She returned to her notebook and began aligning the suspects to means, motive, opportunity. Chiswick. Once a rival, now a friend. But the watch on his wrist hadn't been gifted. He had lied, and possibly entered Eliza's room as cover. His motive could be fear. Benedict knew something. But Chiswick was a man of calculation. Would he really use poison and risk the ledger falling into unknown hands? No. If he had done it, he would have taken the book immediately. Yet it had remained hidden. Eliza, emotional, protective, possibly manipulated by Chiswick, or maybe resenting her uncle's control. Harriet recalled how Eliza's expression had shifted when she saw the watch. Not grief. Recognition of betrayal. She could have acted on impulse, but poison was not an impulsive weapon. It required forethought. Eliza might have known something, but Harriet doubted she'd devised the plan. Lady Imogen. Her composure was her armor. But the crossed-out name in the ledger spoke of a past incident Benedict had perhaps forgiven, or merely postponed. She had motive in abundance. A marriage long stale, secrets uncovered, a threat to her standing if Benedict's notes ever reached public hands. But Harriet's instinct said Imogen would never leave a bishop. Too theatrical. Too traceable, which brought her back to Peveril. A man of service, yes, but Harriet had met too many valets to underestimate them. He had access. He knew routines. And if Benedict had ever humiliated him, publicly or in private, it might have left a wound long festering. Yet Harriet sensed no satisfaction in him, no release, just fear. She needed to test their reactions again, but this time through disruption. That evening, she invited them all to the study. 4 chairs arranged in a square, fire lit low, the bishop piece set plainly on the desk between them. "I believe Sir Benedict's death was no accident," Harriet said evenly, "and I believe the chess piece was a message. To him, and to us." Chiswick shifted in his chair. "To us, yes. Because whoever placed it wanted to suggest motive, suggest guilt. But here's what's more interesting, the ledger wasn't just full of notes. It contained blackmail material. On every person in this house." She lied smoothly. She hadn't yet read all the pages, but the silence that followed told her the story had landed. Lady Imogen's fingers froze on the armrest. Eliza turned sharply toward Chiswick, whose jaw had gone rigid. Peveril stared at the flames, but Harriet saw his throat work. "I'll tell you more," Harriet continued. "The poison wasn't in the glass. It was in the stopper of the decanter. The brandy passed through it. Only someone who knew that could be sure it would kill him. Another bluff. but this one struck its mark.
"I never touched the decanter!"
Eliza burst out. "I swear to you." "I didn't say you did," Harriet said gently. Chiswick looked at Eliza sharply. "Why would you even say that?" "Because you said he drank from the glass you brought him." She rounded on him now, voice high. "But I was awake that night. I heard the stairs creak long after Peveril said he was asleep." Chiswick rose. "You're twisting this." "No," Harriet interrupted, "but someone is. The stories don't align. Peveril says Eliza passed him on the stairs. Eliza says Chiswick came to her door. Chiswick says he went to bed early. And yet the bishop was found after all of that, and the ledger wasn't disturbed. So let's test the final theory." She turned to Peveril. "You changed your story." "Why?" "I didn't. You said the drawing room, then the study. One is a lie. But the truth is this: you never poured that drink at all." He looked up, stunned. "You were told not to. Someone said they'd take it instead. Someone who knew you'd obey. Someone you trusted. And when you saw the bishop later, you assumed the wrong person had died. It was a gamble, but she watched him unravel. It was Mr. Chiswick," he whispered. "He said Sir Benedict wanted to speak with Eliza, and not to disturb them. So he took the brandy in himself. I thought, I didn't know." Chiswick turned slowly to face him. "You stupid little fool." Lady Imogen stood. "Raymond, what did you do?" Harriet didn't move. He thought the bishop was meant for him. He found the ledger, saw the note, and panicked. He thought Benedict was preparing to expose him again. And rather than wait, he acted. He planted the bishop, then poured the brandy himself. But he misread everything. Eliza's voice was strangled. "You said he forgave you. You said he wasn't a threat."
"I was a threat?"
Chiswick snapped. "He said so himself. I couldn't let him. After all these years, after I rebuilt everything." His words trailed off into silence. Harriet watched him sink into the chair, eyes empty. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the sound of rain against the glass. The web was no longer tangled. It was torn. And at its center lay not malice but fear. Fear of truth, fear of exposure. The bishop had been a warning. But in the end, it had been misread by the wrong man, with fatal consequences. Harriet rose calm, her notebook tucked under her arm. She would call Inspector Tarrant shortly. But for now, she let the silence linger. The last move had been played. And the board was finally clear. Inspector Tarrant arrived in his usual purposeful stride, boots leaving a wet trail on the manor's stone floor. Harriet had made the call less than an hour earlier. By the time he entered the study, the fire had burned low, casting flickers over the pale faces of the house's remaining occupants. Chiswick sat motionless in the chair where he had all but confessed, staring into the hearth. Peveril stood nearby, white with remorse, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Eliza and Lady Imogen hovered at opposite ends of the room, tension thick between them. "So this is it, then," Tarrant said as he surveyed the scene, his eyes falling last on Harriet. "Chiswick poisoned the brandy. Peveril confirms he took it in himself. Confession or not, I'll get him back to the station. It all fits," Harriet replied. But her tone didn't echo Tarrant's certainty. She handed him her notebook, neatly ordered with dates, timings, contradictions, and motive threads. "It's a clean case, by every surface measure." Chiswick didn't resist. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, he turned to Harriet with a strange look, not fear, not relief, but something bordering on contempt. "You think you understand it," he said quietly. "But you're still chasing phantoms." Tarrant gave him a shove toward the door. "Let's not give him a stage. By the time the car's taillights vanished down the drive, the house had fallen back into its echoing silence. Rain continued to patter on the high windows. Peveril retired wordlessly to his quarters. Eliza withdrew, pale and shaking. And Lady Imogen retreated with a stiff nod, as if the matter were resolved and needed no further discussion. But something continued to itch at the back of Harriet's mind. Chiswick's words had left a faint stain on her confidence. "You're still chasing phantoms." She returned to the study, now cold and quiet. The bishop chess piece still lay on the desk. She turned it over in her hands. Wood waited, unmarked. She tried once more to trace its origin, but it bore no craftsman's seal, no clue as to whether it came from the set on the mantel or elsewhere. And that, suddenly, seemed deeply odd. The chess set on the mantel was ivory and ebony. This bishop was neither. It had been assumed to belong to the house. But what if it hadn't? She moved quickly to the game board and examined the remaining pieces. None matched the design. Not one. The detail on this bishop was finer, the base thinner. It had not been placed to suggest guilt. It had been brought in by someone else. She turned back to the desk and reviewed the evidence. If Chiswick had poisoned Benedict under mistaken assumptions, then why stage anything at all? Why risk bringing attention? And why leave the wrong chess piece? Unless he didn't place it. Harriet returned to the guest ledgers and letters she'd requested earlier that day. There, among the telegrams, she found one from 3 weeks prior. A note from Benedict to a certain Dr. Simeon Blake. A name Harriet had only just begun to investigate before the confession stole focus. Benedict had invited Dr. Blake to the house for an evaluation. That word struck Harriet now like a stone. Evaluation? Of what? She rang the local exchange and waited through the clicks and warbles of the line until the operator reached the London office of Dr. Blake. After a tense minute, the doctor himself came on the line. "Yes, I knew Sir Benedict," he said, voice clipped and professional. "I was engaged for an appraisal, his personal collection." Appraisal of what, specifically? Chess artifacts, some rare, some dubious. He believed one might be a Plantagenet bishop, but I had to decline the visit. My wife fell ill. Do you recall if he mentioned having received any new pieces recently? There was a pause. Yes. He wrote that a bishop had arrived anonymously. No return address. He said it seemed oddly out of place. Thought it might be a prank. Harriet's blood chilled. She returned to the study and stared at the piece again. Not a threat. Not a message from within the house. A gift. An anonymous arrival. And now the same object had been present at the time of death. She examined the underside again, but this time she noticed a faint seam, nearly invisible. She ran a nail along it, then pressed gently. The base gave a soft click, and the bottom popped free. Inside the hollow cavity a trace of brownish powder. Her breath caught. This bishop hadn't just arrived mysteriously. It had carried the poison. She resealed it and took it directly to the telephone. Her voice sharp with urgency as she rang Tarrant again. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "Chiswick didn't plant the bishop. He wasn't even the first to move it. The chess piece itself was the weapon. But he confessed too. Or confessed to what he thought he did. Someone wanted him to believe he'd caused the death. Someone who knew his guilt about the ledger. Who knew he'd panic and make a mistake once the pressure mounted." Tarrant's voice was tight. "Are you saying he was framed?" "I'm saying the real killer set the board long before we stepped onto it." There was a pause. "I'll turn the car around," he said. Harriet hung up and sat heavily in the chair behind Benedict's desk. The threads began to tangle anew, but differently this time. Whoever sent the bishop had been watching, waiting for the moment when guilt and misdirection would serve them better than direct confrontation. She considered Lady Imogen again. Her poise, her distance. Eliza, with her desperate need for affection and her wariness of betrayal. Even Peveril, always overlooked, quietly efficient. All had been so willing to let Chiswick take the fall. Perhaps too willing. But more than that, the bishop had arrived weeks ago. That meant the plan had been in motion long before the final drink was poured. The real killer had patience. And an intimate knowledge of everyone in this house. And they had not yet made their final move. By the time Inspector Tarrant returned to Beckett's Hollow, dawn was beginning to lighten the horizon, casting the manor's crooked silhouette in a grey, haunted hue. Harriet met him at the door. The chess bishop wrapped carefully in linen and placed inside a velvet-lined box, secured for transport. He looked tired, but alert. The kind of fatigue that had been tempered into sharpness by years of experience. "They've taken Chiswick into custody at the station," Tarrant said. "But we'll keep it quiet until this is verified. If what you say is true, he's not just innocent, he's a pawn." Harriet gave a grim nod. A bishop disguised as a pawn. That's the cruel poetry of it. They moved back into the study together, the faint scent of extinguished coals still clinging to the room like a memory. Harriet gestured toward the writing desk. "There's something else I need to show you. Something older." She unfurled a bundle of correspondence she'd unearthed from Benedict's private safe. Tucked behind the false wall panel, dozens of aged letters, brittle with time, written in a looping, educated hand. The name on most of them chilled her. Arthur Wenscombe. A name long thought dead and forgotten. Tarrant leaned over, scanning the topmost letter. This can't be the same Arthur Wenscombe. He vanished nearly 20 years ago. Exactly. And yet these letters prove he was corresponding with Benedict well into last spring. Harriet pulled out one in particular. Look at the date. Look at the signature. Wenscombe was alive and in contact with Benedict after he was presumed drowned. "That changes everything," Tarrant muttered. "He was declared dead in 1907 after his boat capsized off the Devon coast. But no body was ever recovered." Harriet added, "And Benedict never accepted his death. These letters speak of unfinished business, debts owed, documents hidden." Tarrant frowned. "Was Wenscombe ever involved in any scandals?" Harriet nodded. "He was implicated in a failed railway investment scheme. Dozens of investors lost their fortunes, Benedict's father among them. And yet," she said, pointing to another letter, "Benedict forgave him, or at least said he did. This letter, written just months ago, mentions the bishop we discussed, and Eates' return to the board at last." Tarrant's brow furrowed deeper. "Wet. Are you saying this chess piece, this actual one, was from Wenscombe?" "I'm saying it might be the final relic of a long, dormant grudge. The poison wasn't just about the present. It was vengeance, years in the making." Tarrant took a deep breath. "We need to dig into Wenscombe's old associates. Anyone who might have had a stake in that railway collapse. Anyone who resented Benedict for surviving it, or profiting from its failure." Harriet's thoughts drifted to Eliza. She had claimed to have no knowledge of the financial dealings that had once consumed her brother. But now, Harriet recalled a curious mention in a conversation the day before. A fleeting, almost accidental reference to coastal weather. The kind that would only stick in someone's memory if they had lived near the sea. She found Eliza in the conservatory, still awake, hands trembling around a half-empty glass of water. She looked up with hollow eyes. "I've been expecting you," she said. "What have you uncovered?" "Tell me about Arthur Wenscombe," Harriet said gently. Eliza flinched. "You've found the letters." "I have. And I think you knew more than you let on." Her eyes fell to the floor. "He wasn't just Benedict's friend. He was our cousin. Not that we could ever admit it. His disgrace tainted everyone connected to him. When he disappeared, the family breathed a sigh of relief. But Benedict kept writing him, even sending him funds. Secretly. Why keep it secret? Because Wenscombe wasn't grateful," she whispered. "He was cruel. He mocked Benedict in every letter. Said he was a fool to believe in forgiveness. That something would come due. One day," Harriet stepped closer. "Did you ever meet him again?" Eliza hesitated too long. "I saw him once. Just once, 2 years ago, in Brighton. He looked like a ghost, but he knew me instantly. He said the bishop had been passed down. That it carried justice with it. And when it found the right hand," she trailed off. Harriet's voice was quiet. "Did he give it to you?" Eliza didn't answer, but her silence was enough. Tarrant joined them moments later. Harriet turned to him. "Wenscombe's shadow is all over this. And Eliza has been caught in it." "She didn't poison the brandy," Harriet said quickly. "She believed the bishop was a symbol, a cruel token from a madman, not a weapon. Someone else realized what it truly was." Tarrant's eyes narrowed. "Then who?" As if summoned, Peveril entered the conservatory, arms folded, face unreadable. He looked at Eliza, then at Harriet. "You should know," he said calmly, "that I once worked for Arthur Wenscombe." Tarrant moved quickly, but Harriet raised a hand. "Let him speak." Peveril's voice didn't waver. "I was a clerk in his estate office before the collapse. I lost everything when it fell. So did my father. He took his own life. I applied here under a false name. Peveril was my mother's maiden name. Benedict never recognized me." Tarrant's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. "I didn't send the bishop," Peveril continued. "But I recognized it the moment I saw it. And I knew what it meant." "You let Chiswick take the fall," Harriet said quietly. "He deserved to fall," Peveril replied. "They all did. But I didn't kill Benedict. I only watched it happen." Harriet studied him for a long moment. "No," she said at last, "you waited. You hoped the past would balance itself. But someone else moved the final piece." Tarrant exhaled. "Then we're back to square one." "Not quite," Harriet murmured. Her mind traced the final thread, the one that had nagged her from the beginning. The only person who had been entirely overlooked, and yet always present. She turned her gaze toward the doorway. Lady Imogen, she had not wept, had not doubted, had not faltered. And in that steady stillness, Harriet sensed the faintest ripple of something long buried, finally coming to the surface. Harriet Vane stood alone in the library. The afternoon light filtered through stained, glass panels, scattering fractured reds and greens across the worn leather bindings and the faint sheen of dust on the polished floor. Lady Imogen's absence now pressed upon her like a missing weight in a balanced scale. Ever since the moment in the conservatory, when her name had surfaced like a ripple across still water, Harriet had felt the silent gap her composure left in the room. It was not guilt that betrayed her. It was the absence of it. Everyone else had flinched, faltered, or defended themselves. But Lady Imogen had not once expressed confusion, doubt, or fear. That was unnatural. Harriet didn't confront her immediately. Instead, she turned to an old technique she had used only once before, a method not of accusation, but of stagecraft. She requested that the household be gathered once more in the study under the pretext of a final statement. There was something deeply theatrical in murder investigations. After all, a cast of characters, each cloaked in their own motive, and a stage, a room, where masks sometimes slipped. As the group assembled, Eliza pale and withdrawn, Peveril taut with tension, Chiswick recently released and quietly furious. Lady Imogen entered last, as composed as always, her ivory gloves unsoiled. Her black lace veil lifted neatly away from her face. She took a seat near the hearth without a glance at anyone. Harriet stepped forward and, with deliberate ceremony, placed the bishop chess piece on the desk. "There's one detail," she began, "that none of you thought important." Assent. Heads turned. I asked myself, how did the poison enter the brandy decanter when it was locked away? If the bishop was the delivery method, it must have been coated in the substance beforehand. And yet the poison dissipated quickly enough not to harm anyone else. Which means it was applied just before the game. Moments before. Tarrant raised an eyebrow, watching her. Harriet walked slowly across the room, holding a small silver atomizer. "I commissioned this from a chemist in London. It contains a harmless compound, a scentless oil, invisible to the eye, but one that reacts with heat and certain fabrics. When exposed, it leaves behind a faint blue trace for precisely 24 hours." She let the statement settle like dust on polished wood. "I misted the bishop this morning, just before returning it to the drawer." Several eyes widened. If anyone touched it before now, without gloves, the oil would remain on their hands, absorbed into their skin. And when warmed, it reacts. She produced a folded linen napkin, passed it to each person in the room. One by one, they dabbed at their palms. Peveril dry, Eliza dry. Chiswick, still smarting from his wrongful arrest, passed it without touching it at all. But Lady Imogen, ever courteous, obliged. Her dab left a faint, unmistakable smear of bluish-grey on the white cloth. Tarrant's eyes sharpened. He opened his mouth, but Harriet raised a hand. "No accusations yet," she said quietly. "There's still more." She turned to the chessboard still set on the desk, untouched since that fateful evening. Benedict played only one game that night, with Lady Imogen. Imogen's smile was faint but resolute. He always enjoyed a match after supper. Harriet nodded. "And yet you told me he left abruptly, mid-game. That he received a letter and went upstairs." "I did." "Funny then," Harriet said, turning the board, "that the game is still set at the end of a match. A checkmate in 4 moves. It was not interrupted. It was completed." Imogen's hand tightened against the arm of her chair, just for a second. "And then there's this," Harriet added, producing a torn envelope, found in the wastebasket in the drawing-room. The handwriting matches Arthur Wenscombe's letters, but the postmark is from a week ago. He didn't send it. Someone forged his hand. Someone who wanted Benedict to believe the past was returning. A long pause followed. The only sound was the quiet tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, measuring the unraveling of silence. Harriet faced Imogen. "Why would you forge a letter from a dead man?" Imogen's voice, when it came, was almost serene. "Because he wasn't dead. Not until last spring." Tarrant straightened. "He came to me," Imogen continued, "not to Benedict. To me, filthy, trembling, wanting forgiveness or money or both. He was mad, raving about debts and the bishop and the board. I paid him to leave, and then, 6 weeks later, his body washed up on the Norfolk coast." She folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't kill Arthur Wenscombe. But I knew what he was capable of. I knew the fear he still held over Benedict. So I sent the bishop. I wrote the letter." "And the poison?" Harriet asked softly. Imogen didn't speak for a moment. Then, with the faintest sigh, she said, "He ruined us all in the end. One man. One collapse. And my brother." Benedict kept forgiving him. Kept indulging his weakness, as if the past hadn't swallowed everything. Her eyes finally met Harriet's. "I only wanted it to end." Harriet felt a chill settle through her. "You knew Benedict would handle the bishop. You knew he'd pour the brandy himself. I knew his rituals better than he did." Tarrant stepped forward now. "That's enough. Lady Imogen." She rose gracefully. "So it's done then." The bishop played its final move. As she was led away, Harriet remained still, her eyes on the chessboard. The pieces were still in checkmate, yet everything felt unsteady, every rule blurred. In this game, the queen had hidden as a bishop, and no one had noticed until the board fell silent. The manner shifted in tone after Lady Imogen's quiet confession. What had once been a house steeped in aristocratic pride and ceremony now carried the brittle silence of aftermath. She had not resisted as the constable led her away, had barely spoken. There was no drama, no desperation. Only the composed resignation of someone who had played her final move long before the others even understood the game. But for Harriet Vane, something remained unsettled. Not the confession, it fit almost too neatly, but the shape of everything around it. The method, the timing, the peculiarities of the bishop's poison. A conclusion had been reached, yet her instincts rang with unease, like a dissonant note in an otherwise perfect chord. And that unease solidified the following morning when the bishop went missing. Harriet discovered it herself. She had returned to the study early, before breakfast, intending to re-examine the chessboard and the drawer where she had placed the bishop piece the night before. But the drawer was open, and the piece was gone. Tarrant arrived minutes later, summoned by her terse note. He stood silently as she turned the empty drawer toward him. "It was here last night. Locked. Catalogued. I checked it before I went upstairs." "There's no sign of forced entry," he said grimly. Harriet didn't need to be told. The lock was untouched. The window latch secure. "Someone with a key," she murmured. "Or someone very good with lock picks." They questioned the staff, one by one, but the result was a parade of blank stares and loyal denials. Peveril swore no one had been near the study since the previous night. Chiswick, back in the house on temporary release, seemed furious at the implication. "I told you," he spat at Tarrant. "I've been wronged once already." "You'll not have the pleasure again." Eliza, pale and almost translucent, offered only a faint murmur that she hadn't left her room. But it was not simply the theft that troubled Harriet. It was what the bishop contained. The residual traces of the poison, with the piece missing, any chance of confirming the chemical compound, its origin, its delivery, all of it, was gone. "It's convenient," she muttered to Tarrant as they stood beneath the drawing-room's high window. Too convenient. The one object linking Imogen directly to the murder vanishes after she confesses. Either someone's covering her tracks, or someone wants us to believe she was the end of the line. "You think there's more?" Tarrant said. "I know there's more." They checked the lockbox where Harriet had stored the test cloth with the chemical smear. Gone. And the torn letter from Arthur Wenscombe, ripped into confetti in the study's fireplace. No one admitted to burning it. Harriet stood by the cold grate, fists clenched. Someone's making sure no trail leads beyond Imogen. They want the case shut, closed, forgotten. "You think she was protecting someone?" Tarrant asked quietly. "Or manipulated," Harriet said. By evening, the atmosphere in the house was strained and brittle. Eliza had not left her quarters. Peveril had taken to pacing the corridor like a caged animal. Chiswick lingered too close to the wine cellar for comfort. It felt like they were all waiting. For the story to end, for the dust to settle, for Harriet to pack up and leave. But Harriet stayed. She returned again to the chessboard and began to sketch it from memory, replicating the final positions. The strategy that led to Benedict's last game. And as she drew, something strange occurred to her. The game ended with a bishop sacrifice, one of those theatrical moves meant to lure the king out. But it wasn't the white bishop that struck the killing blow. It was the queen. And yet Imogen had framed the bishop as the instrument of death. Had she misremembered? Or had someone told her how it ended? She flipped through Benedict's notebook, the one retrieved from the drawer during her first visit. The pages were filled with opening theories, strategies, but nothing after that night. It ended abruptly. No account of the final game, no analysis. Which meant Imogen had known the ending not from reading it, but from seeing it. Yet she'd claimed he left the game unfinished. Harriet's pulse quickened. She stepped into the corridor, turned toward the guest bedrooms, and stopped. At the far end, barely visible in the gloom, stood Eliza. She didn't move, just stood there, clutching something to her chest. "Eliza," Harriet said softly. The girl didn't answer. Harriet approached slowly, the floor creaking beneath her feet. Eliza looked as though she hadn't slept. Her eyes were wild, rimmed in red. But her hands gripped the bishop piece. The wood darkened, slightly charred, as if it had been exposed to flame but not consumed. "Eliza," Harriet repeated, more gently now, "you took it. I couldn't let it stay there." The girl whispered, "Why not?" Her fingers trembled as she held it out. "It was never hers. She didn't send it. I saw it weeks ago. Before the night. In the box on Benedict's desk. He took it out when he was alone. He talked to it, like it meant something terrible. I didn't understand." Harriet took the piece gently from her. "Then why confess?" Eliza's voice dropped to a tremor. "Because she thought she was protecting me." It struck Harriet with a sudden, chilling clarity. Imogen had confessed not to shield herself, but to shield the girl. "Eliza, did you?" "No." The word exploded from her. "I didn't. But I think he knew. Benedict, he knew someone had sent the bishop as a threat. And he kept playing the game anyway." "Did he say who sent it?" Eliza shook her head. "But he knew, didn't he?" Harriet pressed. She nodded. "He said it was coming full circle. That the game was almost over." And with that, Harriet realized what had happened. The bishop hadn't been sent as a murder weapon. It had been a message. One that Benedict understood. One that Lady Imogen misunderstood, and tried to turn into a confession before the truth could catch Eliza in its net. Harriet stared down at the singed bishop in her hand. Someone had tried to burn it, to destroy the final trace of its origin. But the scorch marks were not complete. A faint mark remained along the base, a carved symbol, a maker's mark, not Imogen's, someone else's, someone still watching, still moving pieces on the board. And Harriet knew this game wasn't over, not yet. The air hung thick with unspoken dread the next morning as the fog wrapped itself tight around Wenscombe Manor like a shroud. Harriet hadn't slept. She had spent the hours since her encounter with Eliza Cross, referencing the maker's mark on the bishop, against every known artisan she could remember, but the symbol eluded her, a stylized V, with a downward, pointing arrow, distinctive but unfamiliar. It was too precise to be decorative. It was a signature. A message, encoded in wood. She stood in the study now, alone once more with the remains of the crime. The chessboard was still there, unnervingly still, as if time had frozen the instant Benedict collapsed. Her eyes lingered on the position of the queen. If Imogen had wanted to implicate the bishop, why not remove the queen piece instead? It would have been just as effective, if not more so. That inconsistency gnawed at her. There was a strategy unfolding here, moves calculated, not emotional. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, firm, deliberate, and a constable appeared in the doorway. "Miss Vane," he said, his voice clipped, "there's been an incident. You'd better come to the West Wing." Her heart skipped. Woo! The valet. Peveril. The hallway stretched long and dim as they hurried past tapestries and ancestral portraits. Harriet's thoughts raced. Peveril had always struck her as competent, quiet, unshakable. Too tightly wound to be anything less than controlled. When they reached the West Wing guest chamber, the door was ajar. Inside, Tarrant knelt beside the bed, where Peveril lay motionless, fully clothed. One arm slumped to the side. A wash of purplish color spread across his face and neck. Harriet pressed a hand to her mouth. "Poison." Tarrant nodded grimly. "Same pattern." Cyanosis labored breathing. He didn't suffer long. She stepped closer. On the bedside table was a half-drunk cup of tea, still faintly warm. Harriet sniffed the rim. Almond. Faint, but unmistakable, cyanide. Tarrant straightened. "Delivered how?" She scanned the tray. The teacup was one of the Manor's standard porcelain set. Nothing stood out. Except, yes, on the saucer was a biscuit. Unbitten, but lightly cracked. She picked it up carefully with a handkerchief and snapped it in two. The filling had a slight discoloration. "The cream," she muttered. "It was in the cream. Suicide?" the constable asked. Harriet frowned. No note. No reason. Peveril was devoted to the household, obsessively loyal. He wouldn't have broken like that. She turned to Tarrant. He was silenced. He knew something. And someone knew that he knew, Tarrant added. Harriet's pulse had quickened. "We're not dealing with a desperate killer. We're dealing with someone who plans everything. To the last detail." Imogen's confession was stage-managed. The destroyed evidence calculated. And now this. She gestured at Peveril. Each step buys the murderer more time. Or erases someone who might make the next step unnecessary. "Do you think Peveril knew who sent the bishop?" She nodded slowly. "Or at least suspected. Maybe he saw Benedict receive it. Maybe he recognized the mark. Then we're looking at someone with access before the murder. Someone trusted." She looked toward the door. "Where's Eliza?" They found her in the old library, curled on a window bench, knees drawn to her chest. She looked up, startled as they entered. Her hands were trembling. "I heard the shouting," she whispered. "Is someone?" "Peveril is dead," Harriet said softly. The girl's face crumpled. "He didn't deserve. He was kind to me." Harriet sat beside her. "You said Benedict feared something. Someone. That he expected the endgame. But did he say who it would be?" Eliza shook her head, then hesitated. "Hey, he said something odd once. It didn't make sense to me then," he said. "The past is never past, not in this house. It just dresses in new livery." Harriet went still. "New livery. Do you know who his old valet was?" she asked. "No," Eliza said faintly. "He was gone long before I came." Tarrant had already pulled out his notebook. "Well, check the staff records. If the bishop came from someone in his past, maybe they've returned. Under a new name." But as they left the library, Harriet's mind was already spinning. A phrase surfaced: new livery. Peveril had replaced someone. A sudden idea struck her. She turned to the constable. "I need to check something in the east attic. The storage trunks." It took half an hour to climb through the dust and disorder. She found the trunk she was looking for, an old wardrobe case marked RW. Inside were coats, worn gloves, a half-empty bottle of collagen, and a faded livery badge with the exact same V and arrow symbol carved into the pin. Not a maker's mark. A family crest. She held it up to the shaft of light coming through the attic's slit window. Then she remembered where she'd seen that same symbol, carved faintly into the corner of a frame in the drawing room. The portrait of Benedict's father's cousin, Victor Wenscombe. Disgraced and disinherited for fraud. Expelled from the family 30 years ago. Thought to have died abroad. But what if he hadn't? What if he'd returned under a new name, a new face, and placed himself back into the heart of the family he hated? Harriet raced down the stairs, back to the study, where Tarrant was poring over the staff files. Look up Peveril's predecessor. He blinked, caught off guard by her intensity. A man named Harcourt, left suddenly 5 years ago, and before him, a pause. Then, valet named Vincent Parlow, served Benedict's father. Dismissed in '94 after a financial scandal. Harriet exhaled, Vincent Parlow, and Elias, Victor Wenscombe. Tarrant stood sharply. You think he's alive? He was here. Not as staff. He'd never be allowed that close again. But maybe under another guise, a guest, or someone connected to the house socially. Tarrant stared at her. Then who? It struck her suddenly. The chess set. The one Benedict had used the night he died. It was not from his own collection. It was borrowed. From a friend. A fellow club member. Someone who had brought it over as a gesture, and left it behind. Harriet whispered the name. Arthur Wenscombe. The man who wrote the letter that was later burned. The man no one had seen. The man no one could verify. Because he never existed. The knock on the door jolted both of them from their thoughts. A constable entered, breathless. There's been another fire, he said. The gardener's shed. We found a burned coat, gloves, and a set of lock picks in the ashes. Someone scrubbing their trail clean. Harriet murmured. But it was too late. The image had formed. Victor Wenscombe hadn't just returned. He had orchestrated everything. The bishop, the poison, Imogen's downfall, Peveril's death. The game was still being played, and Harriet was the next piece in line. For hours after the fire in the gardener's shed, Wenscombe Manor thrummed with quiet dread. The embers still smouldered under a thick blanket of ash, and though the flames had been contained, the destruction was total. Someone had known exactly what to burn. The coat and gloves were unremarkable, but the lockpicks were unmistakably modern. Polished steel precision tools, not relics from the past, but implements of a mind accustomed to slipping past defenses unnoticed. Harriet stood at the edge of the blackened wreckage, arms folded tightly as the morning mist crawled across the lawn. Tarrant approached from behind, shaking his head. Forensics found nothing usable. No prints. No traceable fibers. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. I doubt they ever left anything to chance. Harriet murmured. Her thoughts were tangled. The burned evidence had been planted, or removed, at exactly the moment the investigation threatened to turn. Victor Wenscombe, long presumed dead, had not only returned under a false name but had stayed close. Manipulating, watching, but from where? She turned toward the manor and let her gaze drift upward. There, near the third-floor window of the eastern tower, was a darkened pane. Familiar. But one she'd barely registered before. Benedict's old observatory. Sealed since his father's death, the room was said to be disused, but lately, she recalled, one of the maids had mentioned lights flickering there during storms. A moment later, she was striding through the east wing, Tarrant at her heels. The tower stairs creaked with age, each step rising into thicker dust. At the top landing, the locked door to the observatory loomed, the keyhole tarnished with age, but the doorknob bore the faintest scratch, new, recent. She drew a lock-pick from her coat pocket and made short work of the mechanism. Inside, the air was dry and heavy with age, but the signs of recent presence were unmistakable. A thick layer of dust had been disturbed in straight lines. Footsteps across the floor, a chair moved. A small writing desk shifted closer to the window. On the windowsill rested a pair of binoculars, trained toward the garden. A black notebook lay partially open, its leather cover cracked at the spine. Harriet flipped it open carefully. Inside, neat handwriting listed dates and initials: BW 6:10:15 p.m. P. Tray delivered 80:10. E. Study window 900. Detailed logs of comings and goings. A spy's ledger. He was watching everything, she said. Tarrant turned toward a tall cupboard set into the wall. Locked. She tried the same key she'd used on the door. This one clicked smoothly. Inside were Foda's photographs and 2 passports, both forged. One bore the name Arthur Wenscombe. The other Philip Harker, 2 identities. 2 masks. It was Tarrant who spotted the final item. A slim wooden box at the back, lined in red velvet. He lifted the lid slowly. Inside was a bishop piece, identical to the one that had killed Benedict. Except this one was pristine, untouched, waiting. Harriet reached out and lifted it. The base was heavier than expected. She unscrewed it and found inside a miniature vial. A sliver of cork sealed its mouth. The glass smelled faintly of almonds. A decoy, she said. He kept a spare. Tarrant frowned. Why? She held the piece up to the light. Because this wasn't about one murder. It was about a performance. He didn't just want Benedict dead. He wanted it done in a way no one could ignore. The bishop was a message, a challenge. Tarrant flipped through the notebook again. He tracked their movements, anticipated reactions. He planted the letter, planted the poisoned chess piece, orchestrated the fire to destroy his false trail. He paused. But something still doesn't fit. Harriet moved to the desk. A pencil lay on its side, its nib sharpened to a fine point. Something about the neatness of the desk jarred with the rest of the chaos. Every drawer had been wiped clean. No stray papers, no clutter. Except, she noticed one corner of the desk blotter curled slightly. She lifted it. Beneath, scrawled in a rushed hand on the wood itself, were 4 words. Nights fall last, always. Her breath caught. It's not over. Tarrant leaned in. You think he left another message? She stepped back. It's not a message. It's a plan. The bishop was the opening move. But the night is still in play. Harriet turned and moved swiftly down the stairs, the words chasing her like footsteps in the dark. Nights fall last. On the chessboard, knights represented cunning, misdirection. The move that comes from an unexpected angle. The very last piece you see coming. Victor had anticipated her. Anticipated every question, every reaction. But he couldn't control the things he didn't value. The casual observations. The things beneath his notice. She stopped abruptly in the hallway outside the music room. Eliza's sketchbook. The one she'd been drawing in that morning, left forgotten on the piano bench when the news of Peveril broke. Harriet flipped through it quickly. Faces, expressions, scenes from the manor. And there, tucked among sketches of the gardens, was one that stopped her cold. It was a study in charcoal. A face drawn from memory, half obscured by shadow. The lines were strong, almost severe. A man in a long coat, standing in profile at the east tower window. She turned to find Eliza hovering behind her, pale and silent. You saw him, Harriet said gently. Eliza nodded. I didn't know who he was. I thought he was just another guest. He came and went quietly. When was this? Twice? The night before Mr. Benedict died, and once 2 days after. He didn't speak. He just watched. Harriet turned back to the drawing. You captured something he didn't expect. A sudden understanding settled over her. It wasn't the bishop. It wasn't the poisoned cream or the burned coat. It was the act of watching, Victor's greatest weapon. And now, his flaw. He had believed himself invisible. But Harriet now had a face, a window, a time. She turned to Tarrant. Why need every guest list from the week of the murder? Cross-referenced with known associates of Victor Wenscombe, under any name. Even aliases. Especially aliases. He's been hiding in plain sight. And now, finally, we know where to look. The pattern was no longer just a theory. It was real, and it pointed to the only move left on the board. The knight. Hidden, waiting. But now, Harriet Vane knew exactly where to strike. For the next several hours, Harriet pored over every guest list, every archived invitation, and every coded ledger Tarrant's team unearthed from the manor's archives. She worked in silence, her thoughts stitched tightly across a mental map that had once been riddled with gaps, but now felt dangerously close to whole. The sketchbook remained on the table beside her, a haunting reminder of the shadowy man in the tower, a man Eliza had drawn, not knowing she had captured the ghost of Wenscombe's past. By mid-afternoon, Tarrant returned with a slim dossier, cross-referencing guests with aliases tied to Victor Wenscombe in past intelligence files. One name keeps surfacing. Harriet lifted her gaze. Let me guess. He flipped the file open. Leonard Fairbairn. She exhaled. Fairbairn had been on the fringe of suspicion from the beginning. A soft-spoken antiquities expert who'd arrived late to the funeral and left early. Nothing concrete had tied him to the case. Until now. There's more, Tarrant said. Fairbairn isn't just a pseudonym. It was the name of Victor's maternal uncle. Died 10 years ago. Victor used his credentials, replicated them. Built a new identity from an old one. Harriet's mind reeled back to the observatory, to the careful handwriting in the ledger. The binocs trained on the garden. He wasn't just hiding, she said slowly. He was playing. What do you mean? I orchestrated this like a chess match. Every move calculated, not just to kill Benedict, but to dismantle the people who remained. He wanted to pull the threads and watch them unravel. Tarrant frowned. Out of revenge. No. Harriet stood pacing slowly. Revenge implies reaction. This wasn't reaction. It was creation, control. Victor didn't come back to punish them. He came back to prove something. She opened the file again and scanned the marginal notes. Fairbairn's academic history. Areas of expertise. Art restoration, cryptography, games of logic. Her voice trailed. He was obsessed with puzzles. Not just solving them, constructing them. Living inside them. She looked up sharply. This wasn't about money or even power. It was about perfection. He wanted to craft the perfect crime, not to get away with it, but to be acknowledged. To be known. By those who failed him, and by those who thought they knew him. Tarrant folded his arms. That's madness. Harriet gave a grim nod.
Yes.
But not chaos. This was a mind that fed on precision. Victor staged this entire affair not simply to kill, but to create a narrative he controlled from start to finish. She gestured to the burned remnants of the shed in the photograph on the desk. The evidence wasn't just erased, it was theatrically removed. The bishop piece, the notebooks, the coat. Even the letter he forged was done with a meticulousness bordering on art. She paused. But the motive, the true motive, is in that sketch. The moment Eliza drew him, Victor's illusion cracked. Because for all his genius, he couldn't account for unpredictability. A child drawing in secret. A memory captured without consent. Tarrant leaned forward. You think that's when it changed? Yes. That's when he shifted from strategy to desperation. The second murder, the fire, it wasn't escalation. It was fear. Eliza saw something he didn't intend to show. Harriet crossed to the chessboard in Benedict's study. The pieces were just as she remembered, except one. The knight was missing. Where was this taken from? She asked. Tarrant hesitated. We assumed it had been lost during evidence collection. Harriet shook her head. No, it was taken by Victor. Knights fall last. That's what he wrote. He sees himself as the knight. Clever, elusive, unconventional. But knights also move differently. They're the only piece that can jump the board. That's what Victor believes he's done. Lipped over every obstacle. Tarrant picked up the phone to issue a trace on Fairborn's last known location. But Harriet stopped him. No. He's still here? Tarrant blinked. At the manor? She nodded. Somewhere. He hasn't finished the game. He wouldn't run before the final move. There was silence. Then Eliza's voice called from the hallway, soft but urgent. Miss Vane. Harriet opened the door. The girl stood nervously, hands clasped. I remembered something else, Eliza said. It's probably silly. Go on. That man, the one I drew, he left something behind. In the conservatory, I saw him through the glass. He dropped a handkerchief and didn't come back for it. Harriet exchanged a glance with Tarrant. Show us. They followed Eliza down the hallway, through the winter garden's arched doors. The conservatory was still and warm, the scent of orchids heavy in the air. Eliza pointed toward the base of a column near the southeast corner. It was there, a folded white square of cloth, its monogram faded but unmistakable. LVF. Leonard Victor Fairborn. Tarrant reached to retrieve it, but Harriet stayed him. Let's see what he left us, she said, taking a handkerchief from her own pocket and carefully lifting the corner of Victor's. Tucked inside was a chess puzzle, drawn in ink on handmade paper, a nearly completed board with one move remaining. Knight to e7, checkmate. Harriet's expression tightened. Is telling me where to find him? Tarrant stared at her. Where? She pointed to the board. The library. That's where the house's safe is hidden, behind a panel labeled E7 in Benedict's cataloging system. Victor's final move. Tarrant reached for his revolver. Harriet stepped past him, her voice calm but edged with steel. No need for force. Not yet. We're not in danger of a brawl. We're at the end of a story, and he wants to narrate it himself. They reached the library together. The hush of books like breathless witnesses. Harriet went to the eastern wall, where the shelving unit bore small brass labels, A1 through H8. E7 was partway up, barely at eye level. She pressed it. With a quiet hiss, the panel slid inward, and there, seated at a small table inside a hidden alcove, was a man in a crisp grey suit. His hair was darker than before, streaked with dye, but the resemblance was clear. Victor Wenscombe smiled. Took you long enough, Miss Vane? Harriet didn't smile back. I knew you couldn't resist a good puzzle, he said. But tell me, did you enjoy it? She stared at him for a long moment, then said evenly, no. But I understood it. Victor tilted his head. Do tell. She stepped inside the alcove and met his eyes. You weren't driven by hatred, or inheritance, or justice. You were driven by the need to be seen. Every move, every death, was a desperate cry to be acknowledged. You weren't playing to win, you were playing to exist. The smile faded. Slowly, he lowered his hands and folded them on the table. That's what they never understood. But I did, she said softly. And that's why you lost. Because in the end, Harriet Vane hadn't solved a crime, she had understood the criminal. Victor Wenscombe remained seated, the small alcove around him thick with silence, as if the air itself were reluctant to stir. Harriet didn't move, her gaze held steady on him, unflinching. She knew the game wasn't over, not yet. Not until he made his final move. Tarrant stood just outside the hidden panel, tense but silent, his hand resting near his holster. Victor's eyes flicked to him once, then returned to Harriet with a faint smirk. "So," Victor said softly, "you've come to deliver justice. Or a eulogy?" Harriet stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "Neither. I've come for the truth. All of it. Unfiltered." Victor gave a short, mirthless laugh. "Truth is a currency, Miss Vane. Spent too freely, it becomes worthless." "You've spent yours lavishly," she replied, her voice cool. "In blood, in riddles, in theatrics. But we're past the performance. This is your last chance to speak without lies." Victor's expression shifted subtly, an almost imperceptible tightening around the mouth. He folded his arms, leaning back in the chair, considering her. "I never meant to kill him," he said at last. "Not at first. Benedict was supposed to suffer. Slowly, publicly, to feel his legacy unravel in front of him. But when he confronted me, when he recognized me, you panicked. I adapted." He shrugged. The plan evolved. Harriet's voice didn't rise. And the second victim. Was that also adaptation? He saw too much. His eyes flickered. "I hadn't accounted for the girl's curiosity. I didn't mean for her to be in danger. But she was. You made her one of your pawns. She was never the queen," Victor said flatly. "She was just a witness." "Nope." Harriet stepped closer. "She was the turning point. The moment your perfect game lost symmetry." Victor's jaw tensed. For a moment, she thought he might rise. Instead, he reached into his coat, slowly, and placed a small item on the table. The missing knight. Harriet stared at it. "You carried it with you the whole time." "It reminded me of the rules," he said. "The knight is the trickster. The unexpected force. The one piece that doesn't move in a straight line. You saw yourself in it?" "I was it," he said, eyes gleaming. "They boxed me in. Mocked my failures. Pretended I wasn't worthy of the Wenscombe name. But a knight doesn't need to follow the path they see coming. It leaps. And I leapt. You killed a man. I killed a monster." Victor spat, rising now. "Benedict destroyed my mother. Had her institutionalized just to hide the shame of her illness. He told the world she'd run off, left her son behind. But she wrote to me. Every year. Until the letters stopped. Until she died alone, in a bed under a false name." His breathing was ragged now. "And when I came to him, to make him face it, he looked at me like I was some beggar at the gate. 'We all suffer in silence, lad,' he said. As if grief was a blemish. As if I was the shame. 'You let that pain become your identity,' Harriet said softly. 'And you buried your humanity with him.' 'Don't lecture me on humanity,' he growled. 'I did what the others were too cowardly to do. I pulled back the curtain. By building a theater of death. No,' he pointed at her. 'By revealing truth through story. Everyone in that house had secrets, infidelities, blackmail, betrayals hidden behind silk curtains and champagne. I didn't just kill Benedict. I exposed them all. I made them look inward.' Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then, calmly, she said, 'They'll testify. Every one of them. Against you. The web you built was intricate, but flawed. You relied too much on their silence. That was your weakness.' Victor's smile returned, thin and brittle. 'You think I didn't account for betrayal? I have safeguards. Letters, confessions, recorded meetings.' 'You won't release them,' she said evenly. 'Because you want control over your own ending. And if you burn everything down, you become the villain in your own narrative.' Victor looked at her for a long time. And then he said, 'What do you suggest?' 'You surrender. Just like that. You've told your story. You've crafted your masterpiece. Now let it end cleanly. Not with another death. Not with running. Victor looked down at the knight in his hand. His thumb brushed the curve of its carved mane. You understand me, he murmured. That's the worst part of all this. You understand? I do, Harriet said. And that's why I'm the one standing here. Silence fell. Tarrant's hand shifted imperceptibly. Harriet met his eye and shook her head slightly. Victor turned the knight once more between his fingers, then set it back on the table. Very well, he said. Tarrant stepped forward, producing the cuffs with quiet efficiency. Victor raised his wrists without resistance. As the metal clicked shut, he looked to Harriet one last time. Knights fall last. Harriet nodded. But they still fall. Tarrant led him out, the hidden alcove breathing out the secrets it had held for so long. Harriet stood alone, staring down at the chessboard one final time. The pattern was complete. The game had ended. But as she turned to leave, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the truth Victor had crafted. Not just the lies, but the pain at its root. Justice had been served. Yet it carried the taste of sorrow. The heavy oak door closed behind Victor Wenscombe with a definitive thud, and for a moment, the stillness of the house felt like an exhale after a long-held breath. Harriet Vane allowed herself a brief moment of relief. The tangled web of secrets, lies and bloodshed had been unraveled, the villain caught and justice ostensibly served. Yet deep within her, a faint unease lingered, an unsettled whisper that the story was not yet complete. Back in the study she paced slowly, her mind replaying every step of the investigation. The missing knight chess piece, the hidden letters, the twisted past, each fragment had finally clicked into place. Still, a shadow remained. Something Victor had said gnawed at her. I have safeguards. Letters, confessions, recorded meetings. Had she truly seen all there was to see? Her phone buzzed, a text from Tarrant, who was reviewing Victor's seized documents upstairs. You need to see this, it read. Harriet ascended the narrow staircase, each step echoing softly in the ancient house. Tarrant met her in the upper corridor, holding a worn leather-bound notebook. Found this tucked inside Victor's jacket, he said, flipping it open carefully. Not in any inventory. Looks personal. Harriet's fingers traced the faded handwriting. The entries were cryptic at first, filled with chess analogies and bitter reflections, but soon the tone shifted. This wasn't just Victor's diary. It was a ledger of meetings and secret correspondences with someone he called the Grand Master. Her brow furrowed. Who is this Grand Master? Tarrant shrugged. No name attached. But look here. Dates match up with the timeline of the murders, and the entries hint at orchestration beyond Victor's solo act. Harriet's heart quickened. This means Victor wasn't working alone. They dug deeper. The ledger detailed complex schemes, not just for revenge, but to manipulate key players in Benedict Wenscombe's circle, including blackmail, financial coercion, even threats disguised as coincidences. Each move carefully calculated to isolate Benedict, but more importantly, to destabilize others who stood to gain from his downfall. Who benefits most from all this chaos? Harriet muttered. The question echoed as she returned to the main hall, retracing the faces of those they had questioned. Harriet's mind flicked to Eleanor Wenscombe, Benedict's widow. Her poised exterior had masked a storm beneath, and though she seemed grief-stricken, Harriet had sensed something colder during their interview. In the dim light of the drawing room, Harriet confronted Eleanor again, this time with the ledger in hand. Eleanor's composure faltered, just for a fraction. But enough. Mrs. Wenscombe, Harriet began gently. Your name appears repeatedly in Victor's journal under the Grand Master's directives. You and Victor were in contact far more than you admitted." Eleanor's eyes flashed. "Victor was a bitter man. He tried to drag me into his vendettas. I refused. But you coordinated," Harriet pressed, using him to remove obstacles in your path. Eleanor's hands clenched the arms of her chair. "You don't understand. Benedict was a tyrant, controlling, cruel. I loved him once, but the man I knew died years ago. And you orchestrated this. The murders, the chaos." Harriet's voice was calm but firm. Eleanor's lips twitched into a bitter smile. "I was pushed into a corner. When Victor approached me, I saw a chance, not just to free myself, but to protect the family name from ruin. By killing your husband and silencing those who knew too much." "Not by myself," Eleanor whispered. "Victor was the blade. I was the hand that wielded it." The room seemed to tilt. Harriet realized the investigation's final layer had been hidden in plain sight, a pact of necessity between two desperate souls, each using the other to bury a past they could no longer face. "But the second murder, the girl," Harriet pressed, "was that you're doing as well." Eleanor's eyes clouded with guilt. She was innocent, too curious, too much like a mirror reflecting the darkness I wished to forget. Harriet nodded slowly. The pieces had fallen into place, but the cost was staggering, a conspiracy born from pain and power, betrayal and desperation. Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. Tarrant appeared, face pale. "Detective Vane, there's been an incident downstairs." Rushing back, Harriet found the room in disarray. The precious ledger was gone. In its place lay a note scrawled hastily on paper. "The game isn't over. Checkmate is a lie." Harriet's pulse quickened. Someone had been watching all along, ready to erase evidence and sow doubt. The mastermind still lurked in the shadows, pulling strings. Turning to Eleanor, Harriet said softly, "This isn't the end. The real game begins now." The house seemed to hold its breath as Harriet realized the depth of the labyrinth she had entered. Justice was no longer about catching one man. It was about outsmarting a shadowy architect whose moves were yet unseen. And Harriet Vane was determined to be the one to call the final checkmate. The note's cryptic warning lingered in the air, a chilling reminder that the case was far from closed. Harriet Vane stood in the midst of the disordered study, eyes scanning the room for any remaining trace of the vanished ledger or the unseen hand that had struck before her eyes. The house, once a repository of secrets, now seemed an accomplice in silence, its walls hiding more than memories. Her mind raced back through every fragment of evidence, every word spoken in hushed tones and veiled threats. Eleanor's confession had peeled back a vital layer, yet the missing ledger meant the ultimate truth had slipped just beyond reach. Harriet was left with a puzzle that was incomplete, but not unsolvable. She gathered her thoughts and summoned Tarrant, whose expression was a mixture of concern and determination. "We need to act quickly. Whoever took the ledger knows its value, and they're desperate." They reviewed the list of those with both motive and opportunity. The household staff had been largely cooperative, but there was one name that repeatedly emerged in their inquiries: Charles Merton, Benedict Wenscombe's trusted secretary. Merton's alibi was shaky, his demeanor guarded whenever questioned, and the ledger hinted at a shadowy figure manipulating events from behind the scenes. Harriet arranged a discreet meeting with Merton at a nearby cafe. Away from prying eyes, she observed him closely, his nervous glances, the slight tremor in his hands as he sipped his tea. "Mr. Merton," she began calmly, "the ledger that disappeared was more than just pages of secrets. It contained evidence that could ruin many lives, including yours. Merton's facade cracked. I had no choice, he whispered. They promised protection if I did their bidding. I was trapped. Who is they? Harriet pressed. He swallowed hard. The Grandmaster. Not Victor, not Eleanor. Someone above them. Orchestrating everything. This revelation sent a chill through Harriet. The true mastermind had remained hidden, pulling strings even from behind layers of deception. We can help you, she offered, but you must come clean. Merton hesitated, then nodded. Over the next hours, he disclosed details of a covert network within the Wenscombe estate's circle, financial fraud, blackmail, and threats designed to keep everyone in line. The Grandmaster was a shadowy figure, feared and unknown, who had exploited old grudges and new ambitions to sow discord and murder. Returning to the estate, Harriet and Tarrant searched for the missing ledger, focusing on hidden compartments and secret safes that only someone close to the family might know. In the library, behind a loose panel concealed in the bookshelf, they found it, safe, but stripped of several pages. Flipping through the remaining entries, Harriet found what she needed: a list of meetings, coded references to individuals involved, and dates aligning with key moments in the investigation. The last entry was a warning. The game ends only when the king falls. With renewed clarity, Harriet called for a gathering in the drawing room. The remaining suspects, Eleanor included, were assembled. Calm but resolute, Harriet recounted the web of lies, the manipulation, and the hidden puppet master behind it all. She revealed how Merton had been coerced to cover tracks, and how the missing ledger pages were attempts to protect the true villain. As tension mounted, a sudden realization dawned on Harriet. The Grandmaster wasn't a separate entity, but an identity assumed by someone present. The one who had subtly guided events, who had stayed just out of suspicion's reach. Her gaze settled on Eleanor once more. You played your part well, Mrs. Wenscombe, but you were also a pawn. The real Grandmaster is someone else, someone who has never left this room. A murmur spread. Eleanor's eyes widened. But Harriet's voice cut through the room. Charles Merton confessed to being forced, but the mastermind manipulated even him. And that mastermind has been feeding us all lies. Harriet paused, then pointed toward Jonathan Hayes, Benedict's long-time financial advisor. Your access to accounts, your closeness to all parties, you had everything to gain. And the subtle clues we overlooked. Your knowledge of the secret compartments, your casual comments that seemed irrelevant, but were in fact veiled threats. Jonathan's face paled, his carefully constructed calm crumbling.
You don't know what you're accusing me of?
He snapped. I know enough, Harriet said firmly. You orchestrated the deaths, the blackmail, the disappearance of evidence. You thought yourself clever, but even the most intricate plans unravel with one wrong move. Jonathan lunged, desperate and reckless, but Tarrant was quicker, restraining him before chaos erupted. As police officers led Jonathan away, Harriet addressed the room. The tragedy was born of greed and fear, but it was the desire for control that drove this to murder. The web was tangled, but every thread led back to him. The room exhaled, some in relief, others in stunned silence. Later, as Harriet packed her coat, Eleanor approached quietly. You were right, detective. The truth was always there, hiding in the shadows we refused to face. Harriet nodded. Justice is rarely simple. Sometimes, it's about patience, waiting for the right moment when the pieces fall together. Outside, the autumn wind stirred fallen leaves as Harriet walked away from the Wenscombe estate. The case was closed, the villain caught, yet the quiet tension lingered. A reminder that darkness often hides just beyond the light. And somewhere, in the depths of that shadow, the game continued, waiting for its next player. Harriet's footsteps echoed softly along the gravel path leading away from the Wenscombe estate, the fading light casting long shadows over the fallen leaves. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks, a subtle reminder that the world outside the tangled web of lies and deception was moving on, indifferent to the darkness she had uncovered. Yet, despite the case's closure and the arrest of Jonathan Hayes, an uneasy feeling settled deep within her chest, a whisper that the story was not truly finished. Her mind replayed the final moments in the drawing room. Jonathan's sudden, desperate lunge, Eleanor's resigned acceptance, and Merton's broken confession. They had seemed like the last pieces falling into place, yet something stubbornly refused to align. The ledger had been found, but with pages missing. The cryptic final note, "The game ends only when the king falls." What had it meant? Was Jonathan truly the puppet master, or was he merely another piece sacrificed on a larger chessboard? She reached into her coat pocket, fingers brushing against a small scrap of paper, the last thing she had pulled from the secret compartment in the library, overlooked until now. The writing was hurried, almost frantic. "Not all is as it seems. Trust no one." Harriet's eyes narrowed. The warning was unsigned, and it was not part of the ledger's official entries. It was a silent plea or a threat, left behind by someone who knew more than they dared say. Who could have slipped it there, and what secrets still lingered beneath the polished surface of the Wenscombe legacy? A chill ran down her spine. She knew the dangers of unfinished business, how the smallest detail could unravel the neat conclusions the world preferred. The villagers would breathe easier now that Jonathan was in custody, but Harriet felt the weight of something darker, something hidden, watching, waiting. Her thoughts drifted to the various people she had encountered: the loyal but guarded household staff, Eleanor's complex mix of guilt and resilience, Merton's trembling admissions. Each held fragments of a truth larger than a single crime, and beyond them, the elusive figure, the Grandmaster, whose name had been whispered but never confirmed. Was he truly gone, or simply retreating into shadows, ready to strike again? As she walked toward the village, a figure appeared across the road, briefly silhouetted by the flickering street lamp. The stranger's face was obscured by a hat pulled low, a cigarette's glow briefly visible before vanishing. Harriet paused, instincts sharpening. The man vanished into the night, but the sense of being watched remained, threading through her every step. Reaching her modest lodgings, Harriet carefully laid the scrap of paper on her desk. She pulled out her notebook, jotting down the connections she had traced, the questions unanswered, and the shadows yet to be chased. The game was never truly over, not for a detective like her. Every solved mystery opened new doors, each clue a stepping stone to deeper secrets. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of church bells tolling, marking the passage of time. Harriet lit a lamp, its soft glow illuminating the room as she prepared to dive back into the puzzle. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a new story was unfolding, waiting for the keen eye and sharp mind to uncover it. With a quiet determination, she whispered to herself, "The mystery never ends." And as the night deepened, Harriet Vane sat poised between truth and shadow, ready to follow the faintest thread wherever it might lead.